So I have a follow-up question, which any of you can answer, which is, what many are looking to the state, to provide more certainty, make this easier. What can the rest of us do to help this cross-agency collaboration and get to this place where we have more, it is clearer and easier?
Put in a permit application.
Yep.
Jump in. Jump in, test the waters.
Yep.
Force us.
And even before you submit your permit, which you should do, right? If you're thinking about recharge now, you should have already submitted your permit. You're running behind. I'm not joking. I mean, we try and encourage people to submit by October 1st. It does take us a couple months. If we've seen them before, we can move them through much more quickly, but there are procedural legal requirements we have to go through. We don't have flexibility on it, and it takes time. So reach out to DWR too for the technical assistance, right? Call us up, send us an email and say, hey, I'm interested in starting this process. What do I do? And we have
even preliminary, just scoping meetings.
Yep.
Great. Do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I was just going to say that, I think that's great. But as we spoke earlier, the cost of submitting, permitting on the odds of having a wet year, you're putting a lot of money out there for these permits with the opportunity, hopefully, to get approved.
Yeah.
But then you have to, it's like, you have to hit the 1 out of 4 to be able to make that work. So are you submitting for 4 years and expending that money? And like I say, it's not inexpensive. And not only that, the preparation to submit is expensive. And it's like roulette. If you hit, great, but you may be spending a lot of money and not getting any benefit for it. Yep. So that's the downside.
And that's a fair thing on how we balance and keep, the board staff whole on working through this, because it's a fee program, but it becomes circular if the fees coming in are from agencies that got a state grant and they're turning around taking state granted dollars to pay a state agency back. Not a finance guy, but it seems pretty circular that we should be able to figure this out, especially outside of, let's say permit applicants that don't have state dollars or didn't get a grant or a GSA, and they're out there, but there probably needs to be some arrangement for public agencies under SGMA that have a grant to be able to not get stuck with huge costs up front, but still preserve the board keeping whole. I don't know what that looks like, but to me that does need to be fixed.
I agree entirely. And this question of, you come in for a permit and it is complicated. I looked at one from the Central Valley this last year, and the application was 250 pages for a temporary permit, and a lot of it was maps, and a lot of it was maybe not as complicated and just printing out forms that they were filling in online, but still it's a lot. It's complicated. It's hard to manage. So what can we do to kind of minimize that administrative burden? What can we do to address the issue where, you can't guarantee that it's going to rain? So do you need to go through that same workload each year? Under current California law, you do. Would there be another process? There's the 5-year temporary pathway, so that would be an option. But maybe there's some other mechanism that we have to think through for, a temporary permit, but maybe it can go out into the future a little bit longer. I know Amanda Montgomery has been kicking around some ideas, and she's our head of our permitting section. Yeah. So, lots of ideas on the table, but we have to take a legislative run to get them in place.
Right. And maybe
can I ask you,
maybe that takes the coordination of all of the agencies that we're involved with to be able to put that together and make the recommendations that are needed to the legislature. Because you're right, you look at a 5-year permit, and I love my son. He's a water attorney, but he's getting rich on a lot of these legal issues that we're running into. And as you said, a 250-page document. I guarantee you there was at least one attorney involved, and probably several other people that were at a very high pay scale.
I think for applications you put in and what you've seen, is some of that 250-page thing just reflecting that they're trying to guess as to what's going to stick, and that if we get to some defined terms that makes it easier, then it'll be easier for permitting and people will know what to submit. So I don't know if that sort of the discussions going on, trying to figure out what to throw at the board.
I mean, I love the watershed idea that Sustainable Conservation is putting out, because, you know, the rules on the permitting were so narrowly confined to a time period that really didn't fit every river in California and every watershed. So I think, you know, determinations, I think I've said this before, watershed determination is critical in determining. And if we had a set of guidelines, we hit certain points, we know what's available, people are permitted to take that water at certain levels as we move forward, I think would be fantastic.
As you can see, we're getting a lot of questions. Megan, how much time do we have? Where are we? I didn't bring a watch. I have 45 minutes. Awesome. Okay, I'm actually going to skip my last question that I was going to do, and I'm going to start going to some of these. I'm going to try to group them. So we're getting some questions around environmental flows. So I'm just going to run through a few and then we'll take them. So how are environmental flow considerations being incorporated into efforts to improve water availability for recharge? Can we do better than the 90-20 rule? Do we need to during flood years? What do State Board, DWR, and CDFA think of California Environmental Flows Framework, called CEF, to assist in permit applications? And I think that kind of, let's see, how do you balance the competing needs of flood flows for Agmar with floodwater that is essential as environmental flows? So you get the gist. It's around this environmental flows, which is a very important issue. Anyone want to start off on that one?
I'll start off. I think the lack of a defined environmental flow is the limitation that Don, you just described. And because we don't know what that target is and what that goal is, that immediately makes every water availability analysis much more complicated, because we're trying to define a target that hasn't been defined. And so if you have to recreate that for every single permit, which is kind of the scenario we're in, then you can imagine how much workload that is. You have to integrate across CDFW, the federal fisheries agencies in some circumstances. And so trying to move forward with kind of baseline understanding of environmental flows, as maybe counterintuitive as it seems, is one of those steps that will help move things forward much more quickly. The downside for many folks, maybe many, is that in most years outside these giant flood years, we're fully allocated, more than fully allocated. And so establishing an environmental flow is viewed as a take back by the state. It's charges of takings you're taking by water. It's not as significant an issue in flood years, but the timing of it, when those floods occur, in what watersheds, and when the floods occur, gets, again, exceedingly complicated. You can be flooding in one watershed, not another, but if they're both tied to the delta, you have to aim for that delta outflow. So the floods in one watershed, maybe that's all allocated out the delta already. And so getting that level of understanding, that certainty, I think is actually entirely contingent on getting certainty around environmental flows. But that's really hard, and it's going to take a long time.
No question, Eric. We know it's a very complicated process, and different areas have different flood periods and different flood flows through the delta. And I don't think any grower wants to deny environmental flows where they're needed. There's no question. But typically what we see in California, as we did this year, were just the tremendous snowpacks. And, you know, you could tell we were headed for a major flood issue. And I think that's, you know, you're right. Typically everything's fully allocated, no question. But we do have years like this, and typically 1 in 4, that we do have, and we should be ready, because typically you've got downstream flooding and property damage and loss of lives. So
yeah,
it's a.
I mean, this year.
Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, I was jumping in. Yeah, this year was extreme, and there was still concern about diversions and what impacts that would have downstream. And this was one that was, you know, for the record books, and we may have another one, but, you know, the concern is like something less than this, and how do you cover that? So, and I think a lot of the flows which do need to be protected. You know, I think we're built upon some modeling and other analyses, but I think there's also opportunities for us to test and monitor when we do some of these diversions, and test and do some monitoring of exactly what's occurring and how that compares to the modeling. So I think we can, you know, address these issues straight on and get to improve the science and understanding, but it is going to take time.
I mean, we're faced with climate change. There is no question. We are seeing bigger extremes in our weather conditions. You know, as a farmer, we see it in the crops we grow. We've seen some real pressure on extreme temperatures, and we're seeing, we had, what, the last 10 years, we had 7 years of drought, 3 years of flooding. And you're right, we had an extreme year. We've had them in the past, but it just seems like we're seeing more extremes. This has been projected, and we need to be ready to be able to handle flood flows when they come and droughts. It just makes the state more resilient, not just for farming, but for the environment and for the rural communities.
So this is kind of a follow-on to the environmental flows discussion that we're having. So I'm going to, the two different questions. One is, what information or analysis does the State Water Board need to have confidence to issue flood-mar water rights permits? And then a longer one, so get ready, it's like 4 stickies. Our work shows that connecting managed aquifer recharge with reservoir operations can significantly reduce flood risk, improve aquifer conditions, and can be designed to provide environmental and social benefits. However, this requires scaling projects beyond the current emergency response scope, thinking beyond the temporary permits of project-specific water rights application. Are there any long-term efforts in place to reduce regulatory hurdles or create incentives to implement large-scale regional flood-mar program? Actually, I thought that question was going somewhere different, but when I first read it. But I think maybe let's go to the kind of the type of information. You were touching on it, but and we know that the watershed flood-mar studies team at DWR is working on these watershed scale studies with reservoir reoperations, but maybe you could speak to the kind of information that you need at the state board to be able to make these decisions with more confidence.
Yeah, I've been jotting down notes. It really, I'll describe it and it will sound relatively simple. It rarely is as simple as we wish it were, but really we need to understand demand and we need to understand supply. And we lump that in together into something called a water availability analysis. It's looking at downstream demands during the proposed period of diversion. And it's looking at the size of the proposed diversion itself and kind of where the water would be applied. In that, we then compare it to known gauge data. So what we know has occurred in the past, and typically we look for about 30 years of record. It's rare that we have that full 30 years of record. And so when we don't, we have to start playing, it's not games, but we have to start taking different approaches about looking at other watersheds, making statistical inferences. So lack of gauge data is a barrier. And I know there's many efforts underway, SB 19 and work at the department to kind of rebuild our gauge network. And that's going to be really helpful in the future. But it's really, supply demand. And then if you have on top of that regulatory requirements, such as, for example, delta outflow requirements or downstream, certain bypass flow requirements, you have to make sure that those are met as well. And so you kind of do a comparison and you see, all right, well, in the last 30 years, water would have been available 2 out of every 30 years or 4, there's some number that comes out of it. And then you have to run it by other interested parties in the watershed. So there's a public comment / protest period, and they get to weigh in and say, well, you missed this. So what about making sure that my needs downstream are met? I have this requirement, and you have to try and balance that out too. So that's it in a nutshell. We just often don't have a full suite or picture of all those different things.
I think you just answered this question, which is the permitting process, is it the permitting process or the method of determining if water is available that is the barrier? And really, it's both.
It's both.
Yeah.
Yep.
Let's see where to go next. How about, we'll do this one. how can public funding be used to encourage flood-mar projects that achieve multiple outcomes? So improving disadvantaged community water supply, groundwater-dependent ecosystems, protection, subsidence, flood reduction, et cetera. And any of you can answer this one too.
I'll touch on it a little, but then I want to hear from Dawn, who's sort of on the end about how public funds can actually be helpful, public-private partnerships. But, I think this is where right now there are no funds available. But I think through grant guidance and others, and even our programmatic actions, we did try to target areas that had vulnerable wells, and we've done analyses to predict the risk of wells that may go dry, as well as areas where there's subsidence. So trying to bring waters in to not just reduce the impact downstream, but also in an ideal way have some other benefits to communities and some of the infrastructure that's been damaged. And I think there's a lot more analysis we're looking at to try to find those real sweet spots, tying in the basin characterization work, the AEM work, and trying to look at not just where the soils are conducive, but where's the water going to go underground. We need the geology and that sort, and overlaying all those are going to hopefully identify those areas that will just be really conducive to getting this done.
Yeah, but, we talk about the public-private partnerships that we have. Our project was built on a DWR floodwater corridor grant, and we found that we needed to put quite a bit of money in to get this project finished to completion. But without that spark, it wouldn't have been built, or wouldn't have been at the scale that it needed to be. So we really appreciate the work that DWR has done in partnering with agencies and growers. It's agencies, but to move these projects forward. And, I'm the chairman of our GSA. And when we first started talking about adding a fee to the land-based fee, we had growers saying they'd pay $100 per acre to be able to get water systems built, to put projects in place. Mm-hmm. So there's no lack of demand, or no lack of interest from growers within these areas that are critically overdrafted. And with the help and the initial funding, I just think there's a lot of potential out there. Right. We heard yesterday from Ellen Hannock, and she said, minimum 500,000 acres up to 900,000 acres of land being fallowed in the San Joaquin Valley, and that's huge when you talk about the jobs, the agricultural production, and really the environment, because idle ground is not a pretty sight. We know that there's repurposing projects available, but a lot of these growers have payments they have to make on land, and they're pretty thin margins out there.
Yeah. But if I can add about state assistance away from grants, because I think until a bond comes, there isn't going to be that expenditure. But this past budget, both agencies got a considerable amount of funds for us to do some data acquisition, basin characterization, completing the AEM work, and then watershed studies. So by providing that technical assistance, that's a cost that GSAs don't have to bear. So we're trying to align what data and resources we have that would be, good assistance for agencies to be able to then go to the board and take this information as sort of foundational to go in, rather than having to create it on their own and maybe do it not in a consistent way, and that helps. And then the whole updating of the water rights system. So I think outside of the unavailability of grants per se, direct payments, we're really looking to upgrade and some of the programs and offerings we have that will offset some costs that agencies might have had 2-3 years ago. And so at least that hopefully will bridge us till we get some more state funds available.
Can I do one follow-up on that question? Because I think it was getting at how to encourage more multiple outcomes from a recharge or a flood mar project. So is there, a way to ensure or to incentivize that it's doing multiple things? So yes, helping restore groundwater, but maybe at the same time benefiting a community water system or helping support a groundwater dependent ecosystem.
I think some of the messaging that we have to GSAs about their plans that need improvement and where there's vulnerabilities is, I think Don probably can attest, and GSA boardrooms, there's discussions about how to address sort of certain things.
Absolutely, no question about it. The message was received loud and clear, which is good.
Yeah.
But you're talking about multiple benefits. It was amazing. We just had essentially fields we have levees around, and when we started flooding them, we started attracting wildlife like you couldn't believe. We had birds, shorebirds we hadn't seen in the area in years, nesting on essentially dirt. I mean, we really didn't have any habitat, and so we're looking at ways we can improve when we do have water to enhance wildlife on our operation. But you're right, you need to get the water in the right place. There is no question about that. I mean, I like to think a little out of the box sometimes, and I would love to see the state and the federal government partner up and attack groundwater recharge in a big way, in a holistic way throughout the state, the way they did in the 50s and 60s when they started building dams. The amount of money that came in, and I'm not saying we need to build dams. I'm saying that we need to attack the problem in the same way on a large scale. We need to find the best places for recharge. Right. We need to be taking care of the environment, no question. But when we do have years like we just had, I think you can start making a difference. And we haven't seen a holistic plan in the state. It's part of the state water plan. The governor's water resilience portfolio that we do these type of projects as part of a water system in the state for resilience. But I would love to see the same effort that went into building dams in California go into securing groundwater for the state for drought periods.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I did want to add one point on the multi-benefit. There's a lot of talk about ecosystem and dry wells. But one area that is going to become increasingly important in focus is subsidence, which SGMA does call for the minimization or elimination of subsidence. And frankly, that has not been happening during SGMA implementation. And we're actually seeing areas pop up where we haven't really seen it before. So really what's going to have to happen is those lands along in those subsidence areas and probably a little bit outside are going to have to cease groundwater extraction, which is probably going to mean that land's going to go out of production. Now, if any of those lands are conducive to recharge and the near infrastructure to pull it off, could be a good opportunity to help alleviate some of the residual and other subsidence impacts. So that's a real near-term issue that's going to come to a head.
Yeah, typically it's being pumped from below the in the confined aquifer and not the unconfined. But yeah, in our GSA we have put an end to drilling below, which there were very few to begin with, but put a moratorium or essentially stop the drilling into the confined.
Thanks for doing that. We have data during this last executive order period that did not happen in all basins.
I understand.
Okay, we've got quite a few questions here. Someone's going to have to keep me on time. Okay, great. Okay, Paul, you said that flood response was job number one, but dairy lands weren't allowed under the executive order, leading or contributing to downstream uncontrolled flooding and filling Tulare Lake, despite evidence that recharge improves quality. Any planned adjustments? And actually, I'll follow up with a water quality question specifically after that.
Yeah, and I think that was in the throes of the emergency, and we had the executive order. We're, concerned, trying to, one, have this executive order preserve water rights, but then also heightened concern that we didn't want to exacerbate a water quality problem. So initially it was just dairy lands being exempted, from lands, and there was some other lands that had been applied with pesticides or fertilizers with, I forget how many days, 30, 45 days, something like that, which probably wasn't happening during the big flood events. But, it really did raise issues and discussion, I think, particularly with state board, regional boards about, and this really got really good because staff got together and we started talking about like what the concerns are. And it was, I think it was sort of like, well, not all dairy land, it's sort of like it kind of got into this refinement that could only occur when staff from different agencies get together and talk about what's actually happening out there and what their concerns are and refining. So I think there's a lot more refinement and along those lines to protect water quality in a way that just isn't so overly protective. It avoids some good opportunities, but that's going to take, again, details, discussions, and going to take some time.
So a follow-up to that is, what is the state doing to evaluate the risks and benefits from recharge from this past year?
Yeah, we've been really pushing, and it especially with the concerns about water quality, was something heightened that now is the time we need to go and start pulling some samples and really test what happened this past year, especially looking at some of the areas that may be sort of the highest risk, the worst case scenarios. Let's go pull some samples, see what that looked like. If clean, then that gives us good assurance. If there's issues there, then we need to start working around this. We can't avoid looking at data and information just for the sake of promoting this really great program. So this is presenting a great opportunity. Stephen may address this later. We're looking to work with Sustainable Conservation on doing some sampling with the board and the Gamma program and building this out. So again, another start to a whole nother aspect of FloodMar.
And another example of how the agencies are really trying to work across your jurisdictions to do that. And
what we've done on our farm, I swear we're a research farm at times, but we've had Helen Dalka out, and we invited. She asked me if she could bring DPR on board as well. We have sampled all of our wells around all of our recharge areas and have a baseline. This was several years ago. Mm-hmm. So we have a baseline of what our water quality has been. And now that we put 18,000 acre feet of water on the farmland in our region, they're going to be following up with additional testing to see what's going to happen, because this is traditional farmland that's been farmed with the normal products that we put on over the years. So we're going to find out. It's going to take time, as everything takes time, but we're going to see the results of that. And because we'd rather know than create a problem. And I think everybody should have that attitude. So we're moving forward with that. We also have another project out there where we have 5 dry wells with another researcher out of Davis, and for actually putting water below the beta zone and actually not putting it on the land and focusing it in certain areas, getting it down and to spread, and actually been pretty successful. So we're trying a lot of different ways. We don't want to create a problem with water quality in the region, and I think growers and agencies need to be aware of that.
Great. Okay. Let's see. I'm going to go to the one that just came in because I got corrected. Ashley, you keep singing groundwater-based ecosystem benefits, but it's really important to consider floodplain reconnection. Completely agree. Via setback levees to have ecosystem flood and groundwater recharge benefits. Can Paul speak to setback levees as a tool?
Yeah, and Central Valley Flood Control Plan, this is a component of that. We've been having discussions with the flood board about that, about integrating, and it brings in another aspect, because all this got thrown to the wall this past winter in a big way, and they're all slightly different type of projects or type of programs. So setback levees, flood management, that's going to be its own thing versus it's different than what Don's doing. With a water right permit, you have that water right. And then there's the flood diversions that go on without a water right permit, and those are different. And there's other water banks that are also different. But I think just the vernacular this past year, it all got lumped into recharge. And so I think we need to somewhat unpack that, especially if we're going to get into really defining what the rules of the road are for each one of these activities to bring certainty. We're going to need to break these apart and distill them down. And that is going to create a lot of complexity, but we still need to build upon I think the excitement and I think the real positive things that were done this past year. So I don't know if that answered the question. I was just rambling off on it.
Anyone want to add to it, or should I go to my next one? Okay. So this is back to environmental flows. Uncertainty in environmental flows does not have to delay FloodMAR. The workaround, do your best to estimate environmental flows, then divert and recharge, then monitor and adjust environmental flows requirement as necessary. Do you have thoughts on that?
I don't agree. Because that way lies ruin. I mean, not just for the environmental flows, but for downstream water users. It's kind of saying, well, let us just do it, and then we'll deal with the repercussions later. And that one is not usually allowed under most of the regulatory constructs that we have in kind of state statute. But then two, it sets expectations, I think, unreasonably. Once you do it once, then the expectation is going to be that it's there forever. And it's just intensely hard to kind of claw that back when it maybe shouldn't have been done. So, it is a more conservative approach to require the input up front. It is a slower approach, but it points to the need for all these other things that we just talked about, the technical assistance, doing the infrastructure development, the engineering work up front that goes into that water availability analysis, that environmental analysis, so that you know up front what the constraints are before you even decide to submit a permit, perhaps.
I'm going to add an additional piece that may come into play with environmental flows as an improvement, because one of the obligations of GSAs and their plans is to address stream depletion. And so there isn't really off-the-shelf methodology for that, and we're developing guidance on that. And agencies are going to start, I think, improving and refining their implementation of that, in the next year or two when the guidance comes out. But that's going to have a profound beneficial impact on creeks and streams to remove that pumping depletion that's occurring. That should bring, I think, a better foundation to in-stream flows that, again, with some of these diversions, you're not going to see, I think, the same baseline sort of conditions out there, so that it is going to be another area of improvement, I think, for dealing with some of these issues.
Yeah, and I do want to clarify that, we have to be, I think, realistic about where we're aiming for in-stream flows. Certain watersheds and basins where streams have been disconnected for decades, just be upfront, are not going to be the board's first priority. They shouldn't be the board's first priority. We have other non-sigma streams where there's still salmon runs. We want to preserve those and keep what we have. So there are caveats and nuances to how we want to approach it.
And now California's a very complicated water system. I've had people say, can you explain that to me in an hour? And it's like, you've got to be kidding. But you get bankers and other people that they want to understand, and I think they just want a basic understanding. But we know that there's a lot of nuances and there's different environmental issues throughout the state. Yeah. But as you said, each one's a little different, and I think we need to define them.
Don, this is a question for you. How can we accelerate the cultural shift toward broader landscape scale adoption of on-farm recharge practices by landowners and growers through local GSAs and technical and financial assistance, more incentives and more outreach? It's a question.
Yeah, sorry.
Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I definitely think outreach is critical. When we first started in our GSA, we had a meeting at a local community, and we were almost run out of the room. It was, you're taking our farm away, that's our water below us. My son won't be able to farm. It got really loud, and we thought we might have to just shut it down and leave. And then because the GSA is our local control, we got up and talked as growers to these people that were in the room. And one fellow finally stood up and said, look, if we don't do this, we're going to be in the same position. It's just going to take longer. And we got a round of applause when we finished up our meeting. So I think the outreach is critical. I think the education, you've got to show people what can be done. And you need examples. And we're not just talking about in like an RGSA that's groundwater dependent. It's throughout all of the regions, especially, I think it's especially harder in some of these areas that are water rich to incentivize people to put the water back in the ground. It means they're taking a risk with their crops and the processes that they have traditionally done during certain periods during the winter. And many of them don't want to take that risk. I mean, it's very simple. They want to make sure that they have a crop at the end of the year and they have some income to continue. So I think outreach is absolutely important. Field days, show people what can be done. I think that's the best way. And I think those that definitely are looking at idling ground have the incentive to do it.
Don, would expansion of crop insurance covering, let's say, a flood mire activity, would that?
Yeah, I don't think if you intentionally put the water on that you would have the insurance benefit.
I'm saying if it was changed where you could get insured for yield loss or crop damage.
That would be helpful. Yeah. I don't know if they have the appetite for that. And
I know.
You talk about a slow process.
Yeah.
Changing insurance is slow as well. I mean, we had 3.5, 4 feet of water on 5-year-old pistachios this year for quite a long time, right when they were leafing out. And we ended up killing probably around 100 trees because we had a low spot in the field. The water remained, turned anaerobic. But so we learned a lot of lessons this year that I talked about in the lunch mar earlier this year. So, it was quite a stressful time. So.
I've got a related outreach question. How and to what extent are your agencies including and incorporating tribes in the decision-making, policy, funding, et cetera? What about local community, and how will success here be measured and evaluated?
I think a lot of this is through the local GSA, who has broad responsibility to involve their groundwater uses and users, and Don can attest to that. So I think it's really going to be, down at that local basin level. And we're encouraging, a lot of outreach. We have community guides on engaging tribes, and we have translation services and others, and other sort of outreach things to help local agencies, engage their community.
It's difficult to get everybody at a meeting, to be honest with you, especially if their income is not dependent upon the situation you have. I know we have done a lot of outreach in our area. We do email blasts. We have our website up and running, and extremely proactive. That I've heard of other GSAs where I've heard of a few that maybe didn't want that input, but they have that. They definitely have that input, and I think that's healthy. And I think it's important that we are inclusive and bring everybody to the table, because you can't neglect a community. You can't neglect single domestic wells throughout your region. It's all better be part of your plan.
And like you said, that's the trust locally, because your neighbors, your community members together, and that's where the trust is. It's not going to come from the state. We can provide the rules, the certainty, but the discussion on projects, I think, at the local level is really where it's at.
Right, and you need good communication between your members within your GSA to get all the viewpoints to the table. Mm-hmm.
Okay, I've got a few about funding. Funding and boom bust funding, like boom bust hydrology, is a problem. I like that phrasing. Could a significant statewide general obligation bond with a large sigma and recharge floodmark component help to provide immediate infusion of investment in this area? I'm not sure if that's immediate, can't read the writing. And just some related funding questions that we can have a conversation about. Is there or will there be permanent funding for floodmar work, including staff dedicated for this? If so, how and what would be the focus? For example, outreach, data collection, pilots, permits, monitoring, et cetera. And then a last one to think about, how might usually richer urban agencies invest in floodmar opportunities in the Central Valley? So a few just around of how do we fund all this?
Well, there may be a bond or may not, so that'll be that. But I think based on, I'll go back to some of the base funding we already got through water rights, improvement upgrade, and some of the tools and data we got, the watershed study funding, our basin characterization. So, and I think just internally having staff aligned to work on this. So I think with what resources that we've gotten in considerably, there's a good foundation there, as well as there's, a large sum of grants that local agencies have that they have not expended, 187 million last September. So those are just getting online. A lot of them are recharge projects, so those will be coming. So hopefully there'll be enough in the queue that we can build the system for the next bond and have something with certainty in the process that will ramp it up. I don't know if you have any other thoughts on that.
No, I mean, the board, we don't typically have that type of funding. We certainly don't in water rights, and our general obligation bonds historically have focused on safe drinking water systems and wastewater treatment upgrades. We have had some groundwater recharge bond funds over the last 15 years or so. Those usually go really quickly. And I think the last round we had over $187 million, but I might be thinking a couple of bonds back. So, and we do coordinate with DWR in that, and it's usually kind of a related or joint effort in many circumstances. I think the question is, to some degree, like Paul was describing, we're doing a lot of work to help support the basic underpinnings of the science. So the watershed characterizations, some of the climate change modeling that Cameron and his team are doing to help point out what future water availability might be like, that all does feed in, but the kind of direct infrastructure improvements, which I think are a significant limiting factor, some of the engineering and the analyses that go into that seems to be where there's this significant need. And we're in a little bit of a catch-22 where we know there's a significant need, but we don't know how to start planning for it until we know how much water we might be asking for. And then you don't know how much water to ask for until you have the funding to figure that out. So it is circular. And I think, there is a need.
And I'll drop one consideration too for the bond. And typically they'll go through putting money in different buckets, a flood bucket, recharge bucket, and sort of this. And I think one of the things we learned this past year, even our programs and funding, and we're looking at this for next year, is we're dealing with both. We're both at the same meetings in emergency status, dealing with drought contingency, dry wells, all those drought water supply shortages. In the same meeting, we're dealing with flood. So what it really is pointing to is the reality of what climate change has brought to bear. And it would be optimal if whatever funding comes down the line of bonding reflects that, rather than, I think, just the historic siloing of funds. So we don't have funds parked in a drought bucket when we have floods, and vice versa, because we were able to do some creative use of funds under the drought emergency for flood, but it's got to be, I think, baked into the system that the funding needs to reflect the reality we're facing from climate change.
There's another barrier that we've been seeing, not quite in the floodmar context, but across the board, which is local capacity. So we've had in a couple of watersheds actual funds to give out, or through coordinating with other agencies wanted to give out funds, but there's just no one there that has the capacity to kind of manage those grants. So
That's huge.
and it gets into this boom bust question. They can't support that permanent position if it's funded through a bond that's going to run out in 3 years. Local capacity is going to continue to be an issue, I think, no matter what.
Do any of you want to comment on the idea of urban water agencies investing?
I'll jump in, but then look at Paul, whether he wants me to or not. There's a huge opportunity there, actually. And you have seen some urban agencies start to take those steps. Irvine Ranch has a longstanding banking project in the Central Valley, and I know it's sometimes been contentious with the board during our conservation work in the previous drought and this one about the use of that water, but they did take those steps. They planned ahead, they banked it. Other agencies have done the same. You've seen similar efforts, I think, start to develop under, I remember first Metropolitan or LADWP with the Antelope Valley Eastern Kern, developing a groundwater bank there. Under the flood recharge work, most of the volume of water is almost 400,000 acre feet. Most of that was from LADWP in the Eastern Sierra, kind of taking water off of the aqueduct there so that it didn't damage it farther downstream. So there's immense opportunities, but again, it's going to require that planning and that investment to kind of figure out where, when, and how to manage it.
Yeah, and I think, Fresno has a long history recharging and programs, and so I think some of those examples would be good. And I think longer term, we didn't touch upon it, where this grows, and we did try to do some efforts this past year to find with these flood flows and high flows, where could we put the water underground in existing banks and other areas? And that could present an opportunity, even if, let's say, CVP or SWP releases, if there's places to put that, but it's still State Water Project water, could free up other water. So there's potential there for better management of the system along the line, but we need to get sort of the minimal sort of baseline things set up first.
Actually, there's a question that you made me think to pull up that is related to this. How is the state Department of Water, DWR, State Water Board, et cetera, identifying the best places for recharge? If doing this, how will info be shared with the GSAs and the public?
Yeah, I think there's a number of factors that go in. The watershed studies are going through some good analysis, identifying, but then again, basin characterization work that's going on is going to, I think remove some of the uncertainty where you do pilots and and that takes time and money, a lot more certainty about where to go, and then infrastructure. So I think all those layers, our heads are about to explode just trying to ramp down on all the variables and things we need to do.
And we've actually given some pilot funding. It was a little bit of funding to actually the city of Santa Cruz, maybe it was the county of Santa Cruz, where they did some of the AEM work, except I think this was called Totem or Dualium, where they just tow it behind a little tractor. And it was in an urban setting, but they were looking at potential recharge basins, and they ran the tractor over 8 or 9 different options. But based on those results, we're actually able to say, oh, I know right away that I should exclude this one, this one, this one, this one. I don't need to do the borings. I don't need to do the additional details. And they did a full cost benefit analysis of it, saved them tens of thousands of dollars. So Sarah Ryan for the city and county of Santa Cruz, reach out to her. She has a really nice presentation on it.
Yeah, maybe just put a plug for the AEM work that the Department of Water Resources, that we've been doing for the whole state, correct?
Yes.
Do you know when that will be coming out?
It's a lot of it's out now, and I think you can go to CNRA Open Data Portal. I'm looking at Stephen. Yep, it's out there, and so there's a good set of data sets out there. They're wrapping the work up this month to complete that work. We're doing some little follow-up, and then once that data is acquired, it takes a couple months to process it and get it loaded, and there's a good data viewer out there to take a look at. So it's out there to be had. So
yeah, no, we totemed pretty much everything at our operation and the field around it, and it's amazing what the detail you can get, and gives you a lot of insight on where to go, where not to go. But yeah, the cities are part of this as well. I mean, they are big water users, and they want to continue to have green lawns and swimming pools, and
And even a lot of urban people like their ag communities out, to keep an ag community going, and ag industry going is.
No
integral part,
question.
Right. So,
Yeah, we support the local communities, and if we take land out of production, then that means less sales, less people are going to be going to the stores and some of their other operations. So it's all tied together.
So we have, did you want to finish it? So we have just a few minutes. I'm sorry I couldn't get, you guys had great questions. I tried to get it to as many as I could. We're not going to get to all of them, but I do think this is a good one to end on, which is, what would you recommend this network dig in on in the coming year, this Floodmore network?
I'll throw a few things out. One, I think with the knowledge here and the broad spectrum, I think just education. I think there's still a lot of education. Again, thinking about like the different types of recharge projects, I think getting a handle for understanding about what the different types are, and I think what the opportunities are, I think would be enormously helpful.
And kind of leveraging into that, defining floods at the local level. And if you can educate about, how to work through the application process, I'm thinking again with my water rights goggles on, perhaps, how to get that permit, but then you're also defining flood at the local level, that will make it easier to move that permit forward.
Yeah, I'd like to see better coordination. When you're dealing with permitting, you're dealing with State Water Board, DWR, Fish and Wildlife, and I really am sorry that Chuck wasn't able to attend today, or somebody from their agency, because they can put in barriers that are extremely difficult for doing projects. So, I think we need better collaboration, and I appreciate the increased speed in permitting, but I still think we can do better. And I think that is a real impediment, and maybe the cost associated with that, I just think we have a long way to go, and I think the urgency is definitely there. The governor has been very supportive of all of these projects for moving floodwaters and moving them and getting them underground. So I think we have our charge, and from CDFA, I would love to put together working groups or something that maybe we can move forward together on.
Yeah, I think along those lines, one thing too is, I think identifying for us what those barriers are, what are those things that are precluding people from doing this or moving forward, because, we have our perspective and ideas, but it may not be exactly what people are feeling out there. And if we don't see permit applications and don't know why, we can't fix it. So I think all those things are going to be important, like you say, to keep that collaboration going and keeping things moving.
So let's give our Fishbowl participants a big round of applause. I really want to thank each of you for being here and being so willing to answer all of these questions. Obviously, the group had a lot, and it was really great to get such substantive and good answers from you. So really appreciate your taking the time.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone. It's been great speaking to people that know the language.
15 minutes. We'll be back at 11:30.